China just caught America trying to sneak 300,000 tons of soybeans through customs under a fake name. But here's the twist. They didn't just reject the shipment. They exposed a multi-billion-dollar scheme that's now reshaping how the entire world tracks food. This is the story of how one cargo changed everything about global trade. This story begins in April at a port city in China. A massive cargo vessel arrives, its hull packed with soybeans, the kind of ordinary transaction that happens thousands of times every year across the world's shipping lanes. But when inspectors opened the containers and ran their tests, something didn't add up. The protein content was wrong. The packaging was wrong. And within hours, an international incident was unfolding that would eventually cost millions, damage reputations, and force governments to completely rethink how they verify where food actually comes from. To understand what happened, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Right now, there's a trade war happening between the United States and China, and it's not a quiet disagreement conducted in boardrooms. It's loud, it's public, and it's reshaping global commerce in real time. When Donald Trump took office earlier this year, his administration wasted no time. In February 2025, they announced a 10% tariff on basically every product coming from China. Most people thought that was aggressive. Most people were wrong. By April, the total tariff rate had ballooned to 145%, then 245%. The numbers kept climbing until they reached levels that made normal trade almost impossible. If you're an American importer trying to buy Chinese goods, you're essentially paying 2.5 times the actual price. That's not a tariff. That's a blockade. China didn't sit quietly. Within days, they started striking back. Tariffs on American coal, tariffs on liquefied natural gas, tariffs on crude oil. Then came the agricultural products, American chicken, wheat, corn, cotton. The retaliation was systematic, carefully targeted, and it sent a message: we can hurt your farmers just as easily as you're trying to hurt our manufacturers. But there was one product that became the focal point of this entire conflict: soybeans. This might seem like a strange choice for an economic battle. But if you understand China's situation, it makes perfect sense. China has 1.4 billion people. That's nearly 1 in every 5 humans on Earth. Feeding that many people requires massive amounts of food, and the numbers are staggering. Yes, China produces enough rice. Yes, they produce enough wheat and corn. But soybeans? That's different. China produces about 20 million tons of soybeans domestically every year. The problem is that China needs somewhere around 150 million tons total to feed itself and meet all its industrial demands. The gap is enormous. So every single year, China imports roughly 105 million tons of soybeans from somewhere else. Think about that number for a moment. 105 million tons. That's not a side business. That's the backbone of China's food security. The country spends over $9 billion annually just on soybean imports. It's the single largest agricultural import for an entire nation. For decades, that soybean pipeline came from 2 places, Brazil and the United States. Brazil supplies about 70%. The United States supplies most of the rest. These 2 countries literally control China's soybean supply. And when the trade war began, that became a problem for America. American soybean farmers had built their entire business model around the Chinese market. In 2016, the peak year, the United States exported 58 million tons of soybeans, and more than 60% went to China. But by 2024, after years of tariffs and trade tensions, American soybean exports to China had collapsed. Where they once shipped 36 million tons a year, now it was barely 22 million tons. American warehouses were filling up, prices were dropping, farmers were losing money. And in desperation, some traders came up with an idea that seemed clever at the time, but turned out to be catastrophically stupid. What if we just ship the soybeans somewhere else first? Here's how the scheme worked. American traders would take their excess soybeans and ship them to Argentina. Argentina is a major soybean producer itself, so no one would think twice about soybeans arriving there. Then, they would put the soybeans into new bags. They would create new documents saying the soybeans were produced in Argentina. And then they would ship them to China, where everyone would assume they were buying Argentine soybeans. In theory, it was simple fraud. In practice, it was far more complicated than they anticipated. In April 2025, a cargo ship pulled into a Chinese port with 300,000 tons of soybeans on board. The paperwork said Argentina. The labels said Argentina. The shipping manifests said Argentina. Everything about this cargo screamed legitimate international trade. Inspectors looked at the documents, and on the surface, there was nothing wrong. So they did what they always do. They ran their tests. That's when things fell apart. The protein content came back at 35.1%. Now here's what's important about that number. Argentine soybeans have specific characteristics based on where they're grown. The soil composition, the climate, the way they're cultivated, all of it creates soybeans with a protein content that typically maxes out around 34%. 35.1? That's not an Argentine soybean. That's an American soybean. American soybeans grown in the Midwest, processed in American facilities, have that exact protein signature, but the protein content was just the beginning. Inspectors started looking closer at the physical containers. The sacks themselves, the actual bags holding the soybeans, they were all manufactured in the United States. The labels were American-made. The shipping materials were from American suppliers. Piece by piece, the entire facade crumbled. What should have been a straightforward import turned into a full criminal investigation. Chinese customs called a halt. They impounded the entire shipment, and they issued a public statement that essentially said, "We know these are American soybeans, and they're not getting into this country." The implications were massive. This wasn't just about catching fraud. This was about something far more serious. It was about food security, national trust, and the integrity of global trade networks. Here's the thing that many people don't realize about modern supply chains. They depend entirely on trust. If a document says the soybeans came from Argentina, importers trust that document. If a container is labeled with an origin, people assume it's accurate. But once that trust is broken, everything becomes suspect. And China's discovery that American traders were willing to falsify documents meant that China could no longer trust any Argentine soybeans without independent verification. The response from China's government was swift and methodical. They didn't just reject this one shipment. They announced that they would begin a comprehensive review of all Argentine soybean imports. They would test every batch. They would verify every document. And if anything seemed off, the entire shipment would be sent back. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. This wasn't China using crude methods to catch fraud. This was China deploying some of the most sophisticated supply chain technology on Earth. Over the past few years, China invested heavily in something called blockchain traceability. Essentially, every soybean shipment entering the country now comes with a digital birth certificate. This certificate includes information about the specific field where the soybeans were planted. It includes GPS coordinates. It includes the harvest date. It includes every single location the soybeans traveled to before arriving in China. If any of that information is inconsistent, if the GPS data doesn't match the stated origin, if the harvest date doesn't align with the season, if the transportation route has unexplained gaps, the system automatically flags the shipment for inspection. But the technology goes even deeper. China has built a massive database of soybean prices across different origins. They monitor Brazilian soybean prices in real time. They monitor American soybean prices. They track the price differences between countries. And they know that if something doesn't make economic sense, if the price of Brazilian soybeans suddenly spikes when there's no logical reason for it to spike, then someone is probably trying to manipulate the market or hide something. In 2024 alone, Chinese ports intercepted multiple batches of American soybeans that had been disguised as Brazilian soybeans. The value of just one batch that Shandong port caught exceeded 20 million yuan. Not caught because inspectors were lucky. Caught because the algorithm detected an anomaly in the pricing data. It's like having a bloodhound, but instead of following a scent, it's following the logic of supply and demand. If the numbers don't add up, the system knows something is wrong. The technology proved so effective that by February 2025, when some Brazilian exporters tried to artificially inflate prices by spreading rumors about weather damage affecting crops, China's system immediately detected the manipulation. The government responded by releasing soybeans from its strategic reserves onto the market. Prices dropped instantly. The attempted manipulation failed before it even got off the ground. But the real fallout from the soybean fraud didn't just affect the United States. It created a massive problem for Argentina, a country that had nothing to do with the scheme but ended up paying the price. Argentina is one of the world's largest soybean producers. In 2024, China imported over 4 million tons of Argentine soybeans. That single market represented more than 70% of Argentina's total soybean exports. Think about that. One country buying more than 70% of your national export. That's not diversification. That's dependence. And when the fraud was discovered, Argentina's government realized that their entire international reputation was on the line. Chinese companies immediately began suspending their procurement contracts with Argentine suppliers. Some canceled deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Argentina's agriculture ministry went into crisis mode. They calculated that the economic damage from the reduced demand and the reputational hit totaled around $200 million. For a country that relies heavily on agricultural exports, that's serious money. But instead of just accepting the loss, Argentina's government took a different approach. They decided to work with China to solve the problem. Together, they began designing a comprehensive soybean certification system. The idea is simple, but powerful. Every soybean exported from Argentina to China will have verifiable proof of origin. Not just paperwork, actual technological verification that proves the soybeans actually grew in Argentina, were actually harvested in Argentina, and actually left from Argentina. This kind of system doesn't exist for most agricultural products right now. It's expensive, it's complex. But the fraud scheme forced both countries to acknowledge that the old system of trust-based documents is no longer sufficient. The incident caught the attention of the international community. The World Trade Organization held a special session in Geneva to discuss the issue. Trade officials from dozens of countries recognized that if American traders were willing to fraudulently relabel soybeans, what's to stop traders in other countries from doing the same thing with other products? Wheat could be mislabeled. Corn could be mislabeled. Any agricultural product could potentially be fraudulently rerouted. So the WTO began working on a new global standard for origin verification. It's something that will take years to fully implement. But the conversation started because of soybeans. What's particularly fascinating about this entire saga is how it reveals something about modern technology that most people don't think about. We tend to imagine that high-tech solutions are always expensive and complicated. But what China developed, the AI algorithms, the blockchain traceability, the real-time price monitoring, these are all relatively straightforward applications of technology that already exists. The expensive part was building the database and training the system. The real lesson here is that fraud prevention isn't really about incredibly advanced technology. It's about thinking systematically. If you understand the characteristics of genuine soybeans from different regions, the protein content, the fatty acid profile, the mineral composition, then you can detect fakes just by running tests. If you understand supply chains well enough, you can detect when the flow of goods doesn't make logical sense. But none of this addresses the actual root cause of the problem. Why were American traders desperate enough to try this scheme in the first place? The answer brings us back to the trade war. When tariffs get high enough, normal trade becomes economically impossible. An American exporter can't compete if they're paying massive tariffs to send their goods to China, so they start looking for ways around the system. They start looking for loopholes, and when they can't find legitimate loopholes, they create illegitimate ones. This is one of the hidden costs of a trade war that most people don't talk about. It doesn't just hurt big companies and farmers. It creates incentives for fraud. It destabilizes supply chains. It erodes trust. And ultimately, it makes the global system of trade less efficient and more expensive for everyone. From China's perspective, the tariff war is also damaging. The Chinese government has responded with tariffs of their own on American coal, on American oil, on American agricultural products. They've also imposed export controls on critical minerals that American industries depend on. But these measures also have costs. Chinese consumers end up paying more for American products. Chinese companies that depend on American imports face higher costs. And Chinese exporters lose access to the American market. Brazil is in a more complicated position. They're not the target of the American tariff war, at least not directly, but they're caught in the crossfire. The fraud scheme that used Brazilian identity as a cover has damaged trust in Brazilian soybeans, even though the Brazilian government had nothing to do with it. Some Chinese importers are now skeptical of Brazilian soybeans and are looking to diversify to other suppliers, even if those suppliers are more expensive. Argentina, as we discussed, was hit particularly hard. And the farmers, the actual people growing soybeans in Iowa and Illinois, they're losing money because their government's tariff policy has cut off their largest market. Some of them have been farming soybeans for generations. They built their farms, their equipment, their entire business model around selling to China. Now they're facing a future where that market might not come back, at least not at the same scale. The same is true for Chinese soybean importers. They're paying more for soybeans now because the tariff war has disrupted supply chains. If they want to import from Brazil, they're competing with higher prices. If they want to try importing from other countries like Canada or Ukraine, those exports are also subject to various tariffs and complications. The only way forward is to pay more or find new suppliers, which takes time and money. This is what a trade war actually looks like when you zoom in and look at the real people affected. It's not just statistics and government statements, it's farmers facing financial ruin, it's importers paying more for food, it's entire supply chains being reorganized overnight because the political situation changed. The soybean fraud wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of an underlying disease in the global trading system. When legitimate trade becomes too expensive or too complicated because of tariffs, people start looking for alternatives. Some of those alternatives are illegal, some are immoral, some are just desperate. What makes this particular incident remarkable is that China caught it. China's relatively new traceability system actually worked exactly as designed. It caught fraud that would have gone undetected in virtually any other country. And it caught it without needing to wait for complaints or suspicions. The system just looked at the data and said, that doesn't match. But the bigger question is whether other countries are paying attention. Are other nations building similar systems? Are they developing the capability to detect origin fraud in their own supply chains? Or are they still relying on the old system of trust and paperwork? For now, Argentina and China are building their verification system. Brazil and China are working on increased cooperation to prevent similar fraud. The WTO is drafting new standards, but implementation will take time. Meanwhile, the tariff war continues. The price of soybeans remains elevated. Supply chains remain disrupted, and somewhere in the American Midwest, farmers are watching their market disappear, while traders are still looking for ways to find loopholes that work. The soybean fraud didn't solve the underlying trade war. It didn't convince either side to back down or negotiate. If anything, it made both sides more suspicious of each other. China became more cautious about agricultural imports. The United States became more frustrated with market access. And the rest of the world watched and learned that the global trading system is far more fragile than most people realized. This story matters because it reveals something fundamental about how the world actually works. We live in a complex system of trade and supply chains that most of us never think about. We go to the grocery store, we buy soy products or meat fed on soybeans, and we don't think about where those soybeans came from or what economic and political forces shaped their journey to our table. But those forces are real. Trade policy is real. The decisions made by governments to impose tariffs or restrictions, those decisions ripple through the entire system. They affect prices, they affect availability, they affect people's livelihoods, and sometimes they create situations where otherwise honest people feel compelled to break the law because the legal options are no longer viable. The soybean story is really a story about how interconnected our world is and how fragile that interconnection can be. One country's trade policy affects another country's food security. One trader's fraud attempt affects an entire nation's agricultural reputation. One tariff war between two superpowers affects farmers and consumers all over the world. It's also a story about technology. China's ability to detect this fraud came down to having the right systems in place. AI algorithms, blockchain technology, price monitoring databases. These weren't secret weapons. They were just logical applications of existing technology. But they worked because China invested in them before they were absolutely necessary. The countries and companies that will thrive in the future are the ones that recognize these kinds of problems before they become crises. They're the ones that invest in verification systems, that build redundancy into supply chains, that think strategically about resilience and trust. For most of us watching this play out, the immediate takeaway is simpler. What we eat, what we buy, what products are available to us, all of that is determined by forces much larger than ourselves. The trade war between America and China isn't an abstract political concept. It's something that affects the price of food on your table. It's something that affects which products are available in your local stores. It's something that determines whether farmers in Iowa or Argentina can make a living. Understanding these connections doesn't make them go away, but it does change how we think about the news we see every day. It helps us understand why things happen the way they do. And it helps us realize that the solutions to these problems aren't technical, they're political. They require governments willing to negotiate, willing to compromise, and willing to rebuild trust in the global trading system. For now, the soybean trade continues under new rules and heightened scrutiny. Argentine soybeans are subject to verification systems that didn't exist a year ago. American soybeans face new barriers to entry in the Chinese market. Brazilian soybeans are subject to more intensive monitoring. And somewhere, someone is probably trying to figure out how to exploit the next loophole in the system. The game of trade goes on, but this time at least, everyone knows the rules have changed. This soybean story is just one chapter in a much larger transformation of global commerce. As tariffs rise and supply chains fracture, we're going to see more of these kinds of conflicts. We're going to see more countries building verification systems. We're going to see more attempts at fraud and more sophisticated ways of catching it. What's really happening is that we're watching the old system of international trade collapse in real time, and a new system is being built to replace it. Whether that new system is better or worse, whether it's more efficient or less efficient, whether it helps ordinary people or hurts them, that remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the world is changing. And understanding how soybeans moved from Iowa to Argentina to China without anyone knowing about it might be the most important lesson we can learn about how that change is actually happening. The question now is what comes next. Will governments work together to build a more transparent, more trustworthy global trading system? Or will trade wars and fraud and rising costs become the new normal? That's the question that matters. And the answer will shape the world your children inherit. Stay curious, stay informed, and subscribe to stay updated as this story continues to unfold.